Chapter 28. From the sanguinary sports of the Holy Inquisition, the slaughter of the Colosseum, and the dismal tombs of the catacombs, I naturally passed through the picturesque horrors of the Capuchin convent. We stopped a moment in a small chapel in the church to admire a picture of Saint Michael vanquishing Satan, a picture which is so beautiful that I cannot but think it belongs to the reviled Renaissance. Notwithstanding, I believe they told us one of the ancient old masters painted it, and then we descended into the vast vaults underneath. Here was a spectacle for sensitive nerves. Evidently the old masters had been at work in this place. There were 6 divisions in the apartment, and each division was ornamented with a style of decoration peculiar to itself, and these decorations were in every instance formed of human bones. There were shapely arches, built wholly of thigh bones. There were startling pyramids built wholly of grinning skulls. There were quaint architectural structures of various kinds, built of shin bones and the bones of the arm. On the wall were elaborate frescoes, whose curving vines were made of knotted human vertebrae, whose delicate tendrils were made of sinews and tendons, whose flowers were formed of kneecaps and toenails. Every lasting portion of the human frame was represented in these intricate designs. They were by Michelangelo, I think. And there was a careful finish about the work, and an attention to details that betrayed the artist's love of his labors as well as his schooled ability. I asked the good-natured monk who accompanied us who did this, and he said, "We did it," meaning himself and his brethren upstairs. I could see that the old friar took high pride in his curious show. We made him talkative by exhibiting an interest we never betrayed to the guides. Who were these people? We, upstairs, monks of the Capuchin order, my brethren. How many departed monks were required to upholster these 6 parlors? These are the bones of 4,000. It took a long time to get enough, many centuries. Their different parts are well separated, skulls in one room, legs in another, ribs in another. There would be stirring times here for a while if the last trump should blow. Some of the brethren might get hold of the wrong leg in the confusion and the wrong skull, and find themselves limping and looking through eyes that were wider apart or closer together than they were used to. You cannot tell any of these parties apart, I suppose? Oh, yes, I know many of them. He put his finger on a skull. This was Brother Anselmo, dead 300 years, a good man. He touched another. This was Brother Alexander, dead 280 years. This was Brother Carlo, dead about as long. Then he took a skull and held it in his hand and looked reflectively upon it, after the manner of the gravedigger when he discourses of Yorick. This, he said, was Brother Thomas. He was a young prince, the scion of a proud house that traced its lineage back to the grand old days of Rome, well nigh 2,000 years ago. He loved beneath his estate. His family persecuted him, persecuted the girl as well. They drove her from Rome. He followed. He sought her far and wide. He found no trace of her. He came back and offered his broken heart at our altar and his weary life to the service of God. But look you, shortly his father died, and likewise his mother. The girl returned, rejoicing. She sought everywhere for him, whose eyes had used to look tenderly into hers out of this poor skull, but she could not find him. At last, in this coarse garb we wear, she recognized him in the street. He knew her. It was too late. He fell where he stood. They took him up and brought him here. He never spoke afterward. Within the week he died. You can see the color of his hair, faded somewhat, by this thin shred that clings still to the temple. This, taking up a thigh bone, was his. The veins of this leaf in the decorations over your head were his finger joints 150 years ago. This business-like way of illustrating a touching story of the heart by laying the several fragments of the lover before us and naming them was as grotesque a performance and as ghastly as any I ever witnessed. I hardly knew whether to smile or shudder. There are nerves and muscles in our frames whose functions and whose method of working it seems a sort of sacrilege to describe by cold physiological names and surgical technicalities. And the monk's talk suggested to me something of this kind. Fancy a surgeon with his nippers lifting tendons, muscles, and such things into view out of the complex machinery of a corpse, and observing, "Now this little nerve quivers. The vibration is imparted to this muscle. From here it is passed to this fibrous substance. Here its ingredients are separated by the chemical action of the blood. One part goes to the heart and thrills it with what is popularly termed emotion. Another part follows this nerve to the brain and communicates intelligence of a startling character. The third part glides along this passage and touches the spring connected with the fluid receptacles that lie in the rear of the eye. Thus, by this simple and beautiful process, the party is informed that his mother is dead, and he weeps. Horrible! I asked the monk if all the brethren upstairs expected to be put in this place when they died. He answered quietly, "We must all lie here at last." See what one can accustom himself to? The reflection that he must someday be taken apart like an engine or a clock, or like a house whose owner is gone, and worked up into arches and pyramids and hideous frescoes, did not distress this monk in the least. I thought he even looked as if he were thinking, with complacent vanity, that his own skull would look well on top of the heap, and his own ribs add a charm to the frescoes which possibly they lacked at present. Here and there, in ornamental alcoves, stretched upon beds of bones, lay dead and dried-up monks, with lank frames dressed in the black robes one sees ordinarily upon priests. We examined one closely. The skinny hands were clasped upon the breast. Two lusterless tufts of hair stuck to the skull. The skin was brown and sunken. It stretched tightly over the cheekbones and made them stand out sharply. The crisp, dead eyes were deep in the sockets. The nostrils were painfully prominent, the end of the nose being gone. The lips had shriveled away from the yellow teeth and brought down to us through the circling years, and petrified there was a weird laugh a full century old. It was the jolliest laugh, but yet the most dreadful that one can imagine. Surely, I thought, it must have been a most extraordinary joke this veteran produced with his latest breath, that he has not got done laughing at it yet. At this moment I saw that the old instinct was strong upon the boys, and I said we had better hurry to St. Peter's. They were trying to keep from asking, Is he dead?" It makes me dizzy to think of the Vatican, of its wilderness of statues, paintings, and curiosities of every description and every age. The old masters, especially in sculpture, fairly swarm there. I cannot write about the Vatican. I think I shall never remember anything I saw there distinctly but the mummies and the Transfiguration by Raphael, and some other things it is not necessary to mention now. I shall remember the Transfiguration partly because it was placed in a room almost by itself, partly because it is acknowledged by all to be the first oil painting in the world, and partly because it was wonderfully beautiful. The colors are fresh and rich. The expression, I am told, is fine, the feeling is lively, and the tone is good. The depth is profound, and the width is about 4.5 feet, I should judge. It is a picture that really holds one's attention. Its beauty is fascinating. It is fine enough to be a renaissance. A remark I made a while ago suggests a thought and a hope. It is not possible that the reason I find such charms in this picture is because it is out of the crazy chaos of the galleries. If some of the others were set apart, might not they be beautiful? If this were set in the midst of the tempest of pictures one finds in the vast galleries of the Roman palaces, would I think it so handsome? If, up to this time, I had seen only one old master in each palace, instead of acres and acres of walls and ceilings fairly papered with them, might I not have a more civilized opinion of the old masters than I have now? I think so. When I was a schoolboy and was to have a new knife, I could not make up my mind as to which was the prettiest in the showcase, and I did not think any of them were particularly pretty, and so I chose with a heavy heart. But when I looked at my purchase at home, where no glittering blades came into competition with it, I was astonished to see how handsome it was. To this day, my new hats look better out of the shop than they did in it with the other hats. It begins to dawn upon me now that possibly what I have been taken for uniform ugliness in the galleries may be uniform beauty after all. I honestly hope it is to others, but certainly it is not to me. Perhaps the reason I used to enjoy going to the Academy of Fine Arts in New York was because there were but a few hundred paintings in it, and it did not surfeit me to go through the list. I suppose the Academy was bacon and beans in the 40-mile desert, and a European gallery is a state dinner of 13 courses. One leaves no sign after him of the one dish, but the 13 frighten away his appetite and give him no satisfaction. There is one thing I am certain of, though. With all the Michelangelos, the Raphaels, the Guidos, and the other old masters, the sublime history of Rome remains unpainted. They painted virgins enough, and popes enough, and saintly scarecrows enough, to people paradise almost, and these things are all they did paint. Nero fiddling or burning Rome, the assassination of Caesar, the stirring spectacle of 100,000 people bending forward with rapt interest in the Colosseum to see two skillful gladiators hacking away each other's lives, a tiger springing upon a kneeling martyr. These and 1,000 other matters which we read of with a living interest must be sought for only in books, not among the rubbish left by the old masters, who are no more. I have the satisfaction of informing the public. They did paint, and they did carve in marble one historical scene, and only one, of any great historical consequence. And what was it? And why did they choose it particularly? It was the rape of the Sabines, and they chose it for the legs and busts. I like to look at statues, however, and I'd like to look at pictures also, even of monks looking up in sacred ecstasy, and monks looking down in meditation, and monks skirmishing for something to eat, and therefore I drop ill nature to thank the papal government for so jealously guarding and so industriously gathering up these things, and for permitting me, a stranger, and not an entirely friendly one, to roam at will and unmolested among them, charging me nothing and only requiring that I shall behave myself simply as well as I ought to behave in any other man's house. I thank the Holy Father right heartily, and I wish him long life and plenty of happiness. The popes have long been the patrons and preservers of art, just as our new practical republic is the encourager and upholder of mechanics. In their Vatican is stored up all that is curious and beautiful in art. In our patent office is hoarded all that is curious or useful in mechanics. When a man invents a new style of horse collar or discovers a new and superior method of telegraphing, our government issues a patent to him that is worth a fortune. When a man digs up an ancient statue in the Campagna, the Pope gives him a fortune in gold coin. We can make something of a guess at a man's character by the style of nose he carries on his face. The Vatican and the Patent Office are governmental noses, and they bear a deal of character about them. The guide showed us a colossal statue of Jupiter in the Vatican, which he said looked so damaged and rusty, so like the god of the vagabonds, because it had but recently been dug up in the Campagna. Asked how much we supposed this Jupiter was worth. I replied with intelligent promptness that he was probably worth about $4, maybe 4.5. $100,000, Ferguson said. Ferguson said further that the Pope permits no ancient work of this kind to leave his dominions. He appoints a commission to examine discoveries like this and report upon the value. Then the Pope pays the discoverer one half of that assessed value and takes the statue. He said this Jupiter was dug from a field which had just been bought for $36,000, so the first crop was a good one for the new farmer. I do not know whether Ferguson always tells the truth or not, but I suppose he does. I know that an exorbitant export duty is extracted upon all pictures painted by the old masters, in order to discourage the sales of those in the private collections. I am satisfied also that genuine old masters hardly exist at all in America, because the cheapest and most insignificant of them are valued at the price of a fine farm. I proposed to buy a small trifle of a Raphael myself, but the price of it was $80,000. The export duty would have made it considerably over 100, and so I studied on it a while and concluded not to take it. I wish here to mention an inscription I have seen, before I forget it. Glory to God in the highest, peace on earth to men of good will. It is not good scripture, but it is sound Catholic and human nature. This is in letters of gold around the apsis of a mosaic group at the side of the Scala Santa Church of St. John Lateran, the mother and mistress of all the Catholic churches of the world. The group represents the Savior, St. Peter, Pope Leo, St. Sylvester, Constantine, and Charlemagne. Peter is given the pallium to the Pope and a standard to Charlemagne. The Savior is given the keys to St. Sylvester and a standard to Constantine. No prayer is offered to the Savior, who seems to be of little importance anywhere in Rome, but an inscription below says, "Blessed Peter, give life to Pope Leo and victory to King Charles." It does not say, "Intercede for us through the Savior with the Father for his boon," but "Blessed Peter, give it to us." In all seriousness, without meaning to be frivolous, without meaning to be irrelevant, and more than all, without meaning to be blasphemous, I state as my simple deduction from the things I have seen and the things I have heard, that the holy personages rank thus in Rome. First, the Mother of God, otherwise the Virgin Mary. Second, the Deity. Third, Peter. Fourth, some 12 or 15 canonized popes and martyrs. Fifth, Jesus Christ, the Savior, but always as an infant in arms. I may be wrong in this. My judgment errs often, just as is the case with other men's, but it is my judgment, good or bad. Just here, I will mention something that seems curious to me. There are no Christ's churches in Rome, and no churches of the Holy Ghost that I can discover. There are some 400 churches, but about a fourth of them seem to be named for the Madonna and St. Peter. There are so many named for Mary that they have to be distinguished by all sorts of affixes, if I understand the matter rightly. Then we have churches of St. Louis, St. Augustine, St. Agnes, St. Calixtus, St. Lorenzo and Lucia, St. Lorenzo and Damaso, St. Cecilia, St. Athanasius, St. Philip Neri, St. Catherine, St. Domenico, and a multitude of lesser saints whose names are not familiar in the world. And away down, clear out of the list of the churches, comes a couple of hospitals. One of them is named for the Savior, and the other for the Holy Ghost. Day after day, and night after night, we have wandered among the crumbling wonders of Rome. Day after day, and night after night, we have fed upon the dust and decay of 5 and 20 centuries, have brooded over them by day, and dreamt of them by night, till sometimes we seemed mouldering away ourselves, and growing defaced and cornerless, and liable at any moment to fall a prey to some antiquary and be patched in the legs and restored with an unseemly nose, and labeled wrong and dated wrong, and set up in the Vatican for poets to drivel about and vandals to scribble their names on forever and forevermore. But the surest way to stop writing about Rome is to stop. I wished to write a real guidebook chapter on this fascinating city, but I could not do it, because I have felt all the time like a boy in a candy shop. There was everything to choose from, and yet no choice. I have drifted along hopelessly for 100 pages of manuscript without knowing where to commence. I will not commence at all. Our passports have been examined. We will go to Naples. Chapter 29. The ship is lying here in the harbor of Naples, quarantined. She has been here several days and will remain several more. We that came by rail from Rome have escaped this misfortune. Of course, no one is allowed to go on board the ship or come ashore from her. She is a prison now. The passengers probably spend the long, blazing days looking out from under the awnings at Vesuvius and at the beautiful city, and in swearing. Think of 10 days of this sort of pastime. We go out every day in a boat and request them to come ashore. It soothes them. We lie 10 steps from the ship and tell them how splendid the city is, and how much better the hotel fare is here than anywhere else in Europe, and how cool it is, and what frozen continents of ice cream there are, and what a time we are having cavorting about the country and sailing to the islands in the bay. This tranquilizes them. I shall remember our trip to Vesuvius for many a day, partly because of its sightseeing experiences, but chiefly on account of the fatigue of the journey. 2 or 3 of us had been resting ourselves among the tranquil and beautiful scenery of the islands of Ischia, 18 miles out in the harbor, for 2 days. We called it resting, but I do not remember now what the resting consisted of, for when we got back to Naples we had not slept for 48 hours. We were just about to go to bed early in the evening and catch up on some of the sleep we had lost, when we heard of this Vesuvius expedition. There was to be 8 of us in the party, and we were to leave Naples at midnight. We laid in some provisions for the trip, engaged carriages to take us to Annunciation, and then moved about the city to keep awake till 12. We got away punctually, and in the course of an hour and a half arrived at the town of Annunciation. Annunciation is the very last place under the sun. In other towns in Italy, the people lie around quietly and wait for you to ask them a question, or do some overt act that can be charged for. But in Annunciation, they have even lost that fragment of delicacy. They seize a lady's shawl from her hair and hand it to her and charge a penny. They open a carriage door and charge for it, shut it for you when you get out, and charge for it. They help you take off a duster, 2 cents. Brush your clothes and make them worse than they were before, 2 cents. Smile upon you, 2 cents. Bow with a lickspittle smirk, hat in hand, 2 cents. They volunteer all information, such as that the mules will arrive presently, 2 cents. Warm day, sir, 2 cents. Take you 4 hours to make the ascent, 2 cents. And so they go. They crowd you, infest you, swarm about you, and sweat and smell offensively, and look sneaking and mean and obsequious. There is no office too degrading for them to perform for money. I have had no opportunity to find out anything about the upper classes by my own observation, but from what I hear said about them, I judge that what they lack in one or two of the bad traits the canaille have, they make up in one or two others that are worse. How the people beg, many of them very well dressed, too. I said I knew nothing against the upper class by personal observation. I must recall it. I had forgotten. What I saw their bravest and their fairest do last night, the lowest multitude that could be scraped up out of the purlieus of Christendom, would do to blush, I think. They assembled by hundreds and even thousands in the great theater of San Carlo to do what? Why, simply to make fun of an old woman, to deride, to hiss, to jeer at an actress they once worshipped, but whose beauty is faded now, and whose voice has lost its former richness. Everybody spoke of the rare sport there was to be. They said the theater would be crammed because Frezzolini was going to sing. It was said she could not sing well now, but then the people liked to see her anyhow. And so we went, and every time the woman sang, they hissed and laughed, the whole magnificent house, and as soon as she left the stage, they called her on again with applause. Once or twice she was encored, 5 and 6 times in succession, and received with hisses when she appeared, and discharged with hisses and laughter when she had finished, then instantly encored and insulted again. And how the high-born knaves enjoyed it! White-kidded gentlemen and ladies laughed till the tears came, and clapped their hands in very ecstasy when that unhappy old woman would come meekly out for the 6th time with uncomplaining patience to meet a storm of hisses. It was the cruelest exhibition, the most wanton, the most unfeeling. The singer would have conquered an audience of American rowdies by her brave, unflinching tranquility, for she answered encore after encore, and smiled and bowed pleasantly, and sang the best she possibly could, and went bowing off through all the jeers and hisses, without ever losing countenance or temper. And surely in any other land than Italy, her sex and her helplessness must have been an ample protection to her. She could have needed no other. Think what a multitude of small souls were crowded into that theater last night. If the manager could have filled his theater with Neapolitan souls alone, without the bodies, he could not have cleared less than $90 millions. What traits of character must a man have to enable him to help 3,000 miscreants to hiss and jeer and laugh at one friendless old woman, and shamefully humiliate her? He must have all the vile, mean traits there are. My observation persuades me, I do not like to venture beyond my own personal observation, that the upper classes of Naples possess those traits of character. Otherwise, they may be very good people, I cannot say. In this city of Naples, they believe in and support one of the wretchedest of all the religious impostures one can find in Italy, the miraculous liquefaction of the blood of St. Januarius. Twice a year the priests assemble all the people at the cathedral, and get out this vial of clotted blood and let them see it slowly dissolve and become liquid. And every day for 8 days this dismal farce is repeated, while the priests go among the crowd and collect money for the exhibition. The first day, The blood liquefies in 47 minutes. The church is crammed. Then, and time must be allowed to the collectors to get around. After that, it liquefies a little quicker and a little quicker every day as the house grows smaller, till on the 8th day, with only a few dozens present to see the miracle, it liquefies in 4 minutes. And here also, they used to have a grand procession of priests, citizens, soldiers, sailors, and the high dignitaries of the city government once a year to shave the head of a made-up Madonna, a stuffed and painted image like a milliner's dummy, whose hair miraculously grew and restored itself every 12 months. They still kept up this shaven procession as late as 4 or 5 years ago. It was a source of great profit to the church that possessed the remarkable effigy, and the ceremony of the public barbering of her was always carried out with the greatest possible éclat and display. The more the better, because the more excitement there was about it, the larger the crowds it drew, and the heavier the revenues it produced. But at last a day came when the Pope and his servants were unpopular in Naples, and the city government stopped the Madonna's annual show. There we have two specimens of these Neapolitans, two of the silliest possible frauds, which half the population religiously and faithfully believed, and the other half either believed also, or else said nothing about, and thus lent themselves to the support of the imposture. I am very well satisfied to think the whole population believed in these poor, cheap miracles. A people who want 2 cents every time they bow to you, and who abuse a woman, are capable of it, I think. These Neapolitans always ask 4 times as much money as they intend to take, but if you give them what they first demand, they feel ashamed of themselves for aiming so low, and immediately ask more. When money is to be paid and received, there is always some vehement jawing and gesticulating about it. One cannot buy and pay for 2 cents worth of clams without trouble and a quarrel. 1 course in a 2-horse carriage costs a franc. That is law. But the hackman always demands more, on some pretense or other, and if he gets it, he always makes a new demand. It is said that a stranger took a 1-horse carriage for a course, tariff half a franc. He gave the man 5 francs by way of experiment. He demanded more, and received another franc. Again he demanded more, and got a franc. Demanded more, and it was refused. He grew vehement, was again refused, and became noisy. The stranger said, "Well, give me the 7 francs again, and I will see what I can do." And when he got them, he handed the hackman half a franc, and he immediately asked for 2 cents to buy a drink with. It may be thought that I am prejudiced. Perhaps I am. I would be ashamed of myself if I were not. Well, as I was saying, we got our mules and horses after an hour and a half of bargaining with the population of Annunciation, and started sleepily up the mountain, with a vagrant at each mule's tail, who pretended to be driving the brute along, but was really holding on and getting himself dragged up instead. I made slow headway at first, but I began to get dissatisfied at the idea of paying my minion 5 francs to hold my mule back by the tail and keep him from going up the hill. So I discharged him. I got along faster then. We had one magnificent picture of Naples from a high point on the mountainside. We saw nothing but the gas lamps, of course, 2/3 of a circle skirting the great bay, a necklace of diamonds glinting up through the darkness from the remote distance, less brilliant than the stars overhead, but more softly, richly beautiful. And over all the great city the lights crossed and recrossed each other in many and many a sparkling line and curve, and back of the town, far around and abroad over the miles of level Campagna, were scattered rows and circles and clusters of lights, all glowing like so many gems, and marking where a score of villages were sleeping. About this time, the fellow who was hanging on to the tail of the horse in front of me and practicing all sorts of unnecessary cruelty upon the animal got kicked some 14 rods, and this incident, together with the fairy spectacle of the lights far in the distance, made me serenely happy, and I was glad I started to Vesuvius. This subject will be an excellent matter for a chapter, and tomorrow or next day I will write it. Chapter 30. See Naples and die. Well, I do not know that one would necessarily die after merely seeing it, but to attempt to live there might turn out a little differently. To see Naples as we saw it in the early dawn from far up on the side of Vesuvius is to see a picture of wonderful beauty. At that distance its dingy buildings looked white, and so, rank on rank of balconies, windows, and roofs, they piled upon themselves, up from the blue ocean till the colossal castle of St. Elmo topped the grand white pyramid and gave the picture symmetry, emphasis, and completeness. And when its lilies turned to roses, when it blushed under the sun's first kiss, it was beautiful beyond all description. One might well say, then, see Naples and die. The frame of the picture was charming itself. In front, the smooth sea, a vast mosaic of many colors, the lofty islands swimming in a dreamy haze in the distance. At our end of the city, the stately double peak of Vesuvius, and its strong black ribs and seams of lava stretching down to the limitless level Campagna. A green carpet that enchants the eye and leads it on and on, past clusters of trees and isolated houses and snowy villages, until it shreds out in a fringe of mist and general vagueness far away. It is from the hermitage there on the side of Vesuvius that one should see Naples and die. But do not go within the walls and look at it in detail. That takes away some of the romance of the thing. The people are filthy in their habits, and this makes filthy streets and breeds disagreeable sights and smells. There never was a community so prejudiced against the cholera as these Neapolitans are, but they have good reason to be. The cholera generally vanquishes a Neapolitan when it seizes him. Because, you understand, before the doctor can dig through the dirt and get at the disease, the man dies. The upper classes take a sea bath every day and are pretty decent. The streets are generally about wide enough for one wagon, and how they do swarm with people. It is Broadway repeated in every street, in every court, in every alley. Such masses, such throngs, such multitudes of hurrying, bustling, struggling humanity. We never saw the like of it, hardly even in New York, I think. There are seldom any sidewalks, and when there are, they are not often wide enough to pass a man on without caroming on him. So everybody walks in the street, and where the street is wide enough, carriages are forever dashing along. Why 1,000 people are not run over and crippled every day is a mystery that no man can solve. But if there is an eighth wonder in the world, it must be the dwelling houses of Naples. I honestly believe a good majority of them are 100 feet high, and the solid brick walls are 7 feet through. You go up 9 flights of stairs before you get to the first floor. No, not 9, but they're there or thereabouts. There is a little bird cage of an iron railing in front of every window, clear away up, up among the eternal clouds where the roof is. And there is always somebody looking out of every window. People of ordinary size looking out from the first floor, people a shade smaller from the second, people that look a little small yet from the third, and from thence upward they grow smaller and smaller by a regularly graduated diminution, until folks in the topmost windows seem more like birds in an uncommonly tall martin box than anything else. The perspective of one of those narrow cracks of street with its rows of tall houses stretching away till they come together in the distance like railway tracks, its clotheslines crossing over at all altitudes and waving their bannered raggedness over the swarms of people below, and the white-dressed women perched in balcony railings all the way from the pavement up to the heavens. A perspective like that is really worth going into Neapolitan details to see. Naples, with its immediate suburbs, contains 675,000 inhabitants, but I am satisfied it covers no more ground than an American city of 150,000. It reaches up into the air infinitely higher than 3 American cities, though, and this is where the secret of it lies, I will observe here, in passing, that the contrasts between opulence and poverty, and magnificence and misery, are more frequent and more striking in Naples than in Paris even. One must go to the Bois de Boulogne to see fashionable dressing, splendid equipages, and stunning liveries, and to the Faubourg Saint Antoine to see vice, misery, hunger, rags, dirt. But in the thoroughfares of Naples, these things are all mixed together. Naked boys of 9 years and the fancy-dressed children of luxury, shreds and tatters, and brilliant uniforms, jackass carts and state carriages, beggars, princes, and bishops jostle each other in every street. At 6 o'clock every evening, all Naples turns out to drive on the Riviera di Chiaja, whichever that may mean, and for 2 hours one may stand there and see the motliest and worst mixed procession go by that ever eyes beheld. Princes, there are more princes than policemen in Naples. The city is infested with them. Princes who live up 7 flights of stairs and don't own any principalities will keep a carriage and go hungry, and clerks, mechanics, milliners, and strumpets will go without their dinners and squander the money on a hack ride in the Chiaja. The ragtag and the rubbish of the city stack themselves up to the number of 20 or 30 on a rickety little go-kart hauled by a donkey not much bigger than a cat, and they drive in the Chiaja. Dukes and bankers in sumptuous carriages and with gorgeous drivers and footmen turn out also, and so the furious procession goes. For 2 hours rank and wealth and obscurity and poverty clatter along side by side in the wild procession, and then go home, serene, happy, covered with glory. I was looking at a magnificent marble staircase in the king's palace the other day, which it was said cost 5 million francs. And I suppose it did cost 500,000, maybe. I felt as if it must be a fine thing to live in a country where there was such comfort and such luxury as this. And then I stepped out, musing, and almost walked over a vagabond who was eating his dinner on the curbstone, a piece of bread and a bunch of grapes. When I found that this Mustang was clerking in a fruit establishment, he had the establishment along with him in a basket, at 2 cents a day, and that he had no place at home where he lived, I lost some of my enthusiasm concerning the happiness of living in Italy. This naturally suggests to me a thought about wages here. Lieutenants in the army get about $1 a day, and common soldiers a couple of cents. I only know one clerk, he gets $4 a month. Printers get $6.50 a month, but I have heard of a foreman who gets 13. To be growing suddenly and violently rich as this man is naturally makes him a bloated aristocrat. The airs he puts on are insufferable. And speaking of wages, reminds me of prices of merchandise. In Paris, you pay $12 a dozen for a Juven's best kid gloves. Gloves of about as good quality sell here at $3 or $4 a dozen. You pay $5 and $6 a piece for fine linen shirts in Paris. Here and in Leghorn, you pay $2.50. In Marseille, you pay $40 for a first-class dress coat made by a good tailor. but in Leghorn you can get a full dress suit for the same money. Here you get handsome business suits at from $10 to $20, and in Leghorn you can get an overcoat for $15 that would cost you $70 in New York. Fine kid boots are worth $8 in Marseille and $4 here. Lyons velvets rank higher in America than those of Genoa, yet the bulk of Lyons velvets you buy in the States are made in Genoa and imported into Lyons, where they receive the Lyons stamp and are then exported to America. You can buy enough velvet in Genoa for $25 to make a $500 cloak in New York. So the ladies tell me. Of course, these things bring me back, by a natural and easy transition, to the ascent of Vesuvius. And thus the wonderful Blue Grotto is suggested to me. It is situated on the island of Capri, 22 miles from Naples. We chartered a little steamer and went out there. Of course, the police boarded us and put us through a health examination and inquired into our politics before they would let us land. The airs these little insect governments put on are in the last degree ridiculous. They even put a policeman on board of our boat to keep an eye on us as long as we were in the Capri dominions. They thought we wanted to steal the grotto, I suppose. It was worth stealing. The entrance to the cave is 4 feet high and 4 feet wide, and is in the face of a lofty perpendicular cliff, the sea wall. You enter in small boats, and a tight squeeze it is, too. You cannot go in at all when the tide is up. Once within, you find yourself in an arched cavern about 160 feet long, 120 wide, and about 70 high. How deep it is, no man knows. It goes down to the bottom of the ocean. The waters of this placid subterranean lake are the brightest, loveliest blue that can be imagined. They are as transparent as plate glass, and their coloring would shame the richest sky that ever bent over Italy. No tint could be more ravishing, no luster more superb. Throw a stone into the water, and the myriad of tiny bubbles that are created flash out a brilliant glare, like blue theatrical fires. Dip an oar, and its blade turns to splendid frosted silver, tinted with blue. Let a man jump in, and instantly he is cased in an armor more gorgeous than ever a kingly crusader wore. Then we went to Ischia, but I had already been to that island and tired myself to death resting a couple of days and studying human villainy with the landlord of the Grand Sentinel for a model. So we went to Procida, and from thence to Pazuli, where the St. Paul landed after he sailed from Samos. I landed at precisely the same spot where St. Paul landed, and so did Dan and the others. It was a remarkable coincidence. St. Paul preached to these people 7 days before he started to Rome. Nero's baths, the ruins of Baiae, the temple of Serapis, Cumae, where the Cumaean Sibyl interpreted the oracles, the lake Agnano with its ancient submerged city still visible far down in its depths. These and 100 other points of interest we examined with critical imbecility, but the Grotto of the Dog claimed our chief attention, because we had heard and read so much about it. Everybody has written about the Grotto del Cane and its poisonous vapors, from Pliny down to Smith, and every tourist has held a dog over its floor by the legs to test the capabilities of the place. The dog dies in a minute and a half, a chicken instantly. As a general thing, strangers who crawl in there go to sleep. To go to sleep, do not get up until they are called, and then they don't either. The stranger that ventures to sleep there takes a permanent contract. I longed to see this grotto. I resolved to take a dog and hold him myself, suffocate him a little, and time him, suffocate him some more, and then finish him. We reached the grotto at about 3 in the afternoon, and proceeded at once to make the experiments. But now an important difficulty presented itself. We had no dog. At the Hermitage, we were about 15 or 1800 feet above the sea, and thus far a portion of the ascent had been pretty abrupt. For the next 2 miles the road was a mixture. Sometimes the ascent was abrupt, and sometimes it was not. But one characteristic it possessed all the time, without failure, without modification. It was all uncompromisingly and unspeakably infamous. It was a rough, narrow trail, and led over an old lava flow, a black ocean which was tumbled into 1,000 fantastic shapes, a wild chaos of ruin, desolation, and barrenness, a wilderness of billowy upheavals, of furious whirlpools, of miniature mountains rent asunder, of gnarled and knotted, wrinkled and twisted masses of blackness that mimicked branching roots, great vines, trunks of trees, all interlaced and mingled together in all these weird shapes, all this turbulent panorama, all this stormy, far-stretching waste of blackness, with its thrilling suggestiveness of life, of action, of boiling, surging, furious motion, was petrified, all stricken dead and cold in the instant of its maddest rioting, fettered, paralyzed, and left to glower at heaven in impotent rage forevermore. Finally, we stood in a level, narrow valley, a valley that had been created by the terrific march of some old-time eruption, and on either hand towered the 2 steep peaks of Vesuvius. The one we had to climb, the one that contains the active volcano, seemed about 800 or 1,000 feet high, and looked almost too straight up and down for any man to climb, and certainly no mule could climb it with a man on his back. 4 of these native pirates will carry you to the top in a sedan chair, if you wish it, but suppose they were to slip and let you fall. Is it likely that you would ever stop rolling? Not this side of eternity, perhaps. We left the mules, sharpened our fingernails, and began the ascent I have been writing about so long. At 20 minutes to 6 in the morning, the path led straight up a rugged sweep of those loose chunks of pumice stone, and for about every 2 steps forward we took, we slid back 1. It was so excessively steep that we had to stop every 50 or 60 steps and rest a moment. To see our comrades, we had to look very nearly straight up at those above us, and very nearly straight down at those below. We stood on the summit at last. It had taken an hour and 15 minutes to make the trip. What we saw there was simply a circular crater, a circular ditch, if you please, about 200 feet deep and 400 or 500 feet wide, whose inner wall was about half a mile in circumference. In the center of the great circus ring thus formed was a torn and ragged upheaval 100 feet high, all snowed over with a sulfur crust of many a brilliant and beautiful color. And the ditch enclosed this like the moat of a castle, or surrounded it as a little river does a little island, if the simile is better. The sulfur coating of that island was gaudy in the extreme. All mingled together in the richest confusion were red, blue, brown, black, yellow, white. I don't know that there was a color, or shade of a color, or combination of colors unrepresented, and when the sun burst through the morning mists and fired this tinged magnificence, it topped imperial Vesuvius like a jeweled crown. The crater itself, the ditch, was not so variegated in coloring, but yet in its softness, richness, and unpretentious elegance, it was more charming, more fascinating to the eye. There was nothing loud about its well-bred and well-creased look. Beautiful, one could stand and look down upon it for a week without getting tired of it. It had the semblance of a pleasant meadow, whose slender grasses and whose velvety mosses were frosted with a shining dust, and tinted with palest green that deepened gradually to the darkest hue of the orange leaf, and deepened yet again into gravest brown, then faded into orange, then into brightest gold, and culminated in the delicate pink of a new-blown rose. Where portions of the meadow had sunk, and where other portions had been broken up like an ice floe, the cavernous openings of the one and the ragged upturned edges exposed by the other were hung with a laced work of soft-tinted crystals of sulphur that changed their deformities into quaint shapes and figures that were full of grace and beauty. The walls of the ditch were brilliant with yellow banks of sulphur and with lava and pumice stone of many colors. No fire was visible anywhere, but gusts of sulphurous steam issued silently and invisibly from 1,000 little cracks and fissures in the crater, and were wafted to our noses with every breeze. But so long as we kept our nostrils buried in our handkerchiefs, there was small danger of suffocation. Some of the boys thrust long slips of paper down into the holes and set them on fire, and so achieved the glory of lighting their cigars by the flames of Vesuvius, and others cooked eggs over fissures in the rocks and were happy. The view from the summit would have been superb but for the fact that the sun could only pierce the mists at long intervals. Thus the glimpses we had of the grand panorama below were only fitful and unsatisfactory. The descent of the mountain was a labor of only 4 minutes. Instead of stalking down the rugged path we ascended, we chose one which was bedded knee-deep in loose ashes, and plowed our way with prodigious strides that would almost have shamed the performances of him of the 7-league boots. The Vesuvius today is a very poor affair compared to the mighty volcano Kilauea in the Sandwich Islands, which I am glad I visited. But I am glad I visited it. It was well worth it. It is said that during one of the grand eruptions of Vesuvius, it discharged massy rocks weighing many tons 1,000 feet into the air. Its vast jets of smoke and steam ascended 30 miles toward the firmament, and clouds of its ashes were wafted abroad and fell upon the decks of ships 750 miles at sea. I will take the ashes at a moderate discount, if anyone will take the 30 miles of smoke, but I do not feel able to take a commanding interest in the whole story by myself. Chapter 31. The Buried City of Pompeii. They pronounce it Pompeii. I always had an idea that you went down into Pompeii with torches, by the way of damp, dark stairways, just as you do in silver mines, and traversed gloomy tunnels with lava overhead and something on either hand like dilapidated prisons gouged out of the solid earth that faintly resembled houses, but you do nothing of the kind. Fully 1/2 of the buried city, perhaps, is completely exhumed and thrown upon freely to the light of day, and there stand the long rows of solidly built brick houses, roofless, just as they stood 1,800 years ago, hot with the flaming sun. And there lie their floors, clean swept, and not a bright fragment tarnished or waiting on the labored mosaics that pictured them, with the beasts, the birds, and flowers which we copy in perishable carpets today. And here are the Venuses and Bacchuses and Adonises making love and getting drunk in many-hued frescoes on the walls of saloon and bedchamber. And there are the narrow streets and narrower sidewalks paved with flags of good hard lava, the one deeply rutted with the chariot wheels, and the other with the passing feet of the Pompeians of gone-by centuries. And there are the bake shops, the temples, the halls of justice, the baths, the theaters, all clean scraped and neat, and suggestion nothing of the nature of a silver mine away down in the bowels of the earth. The broken pillars lying about, the doorless doorways, and the crumbled tops of the wilderness of walls were wonderfully suggestive of the burnt district in one of our cities, as if there had been any charred timbers. And if there had been any charred timbers, shattered windows, heaps of debris, and general blackness and smokiness about the place, the resemblance would have been perfect. But no, the sun shines as brightly down on old Pompeii today as it did when Christ was born in Bethlehem, and its streets are cleaner 100 times than ever a Pompeian saw them in her prime. I know whereof I speak, for in the great chief thoroughfares, Merchant Street and the Street of Fortune, I have not seen with my own eyes for 200 years at least the pavements were not repaired, how ruts 5 and even 10 inches deep were worn into the thick flagstones by the chariot wheels of generations of swindled taxpayers. And do I not know by these signs that street commissioners of Pompeii never attended to their business, and that if they never mended the pavements, they never cleaned them? And besides, is it not the inborn nature of street commissioners to avoid their duty whenever they get a chance? I wish I knew the name of the last one that held office in Pompeii, so that I could give him a blast. I speak with feeling on this subject, because I caught my foot in one of those ruts, and the sadness that came over me when I saw the first poor skeleton, with ashes and lava sticking to it, was tempered by the reflection that maybe that party was the street commissioner. No, Pompeii is no longer a buried city. It is a city of hundreds and hundreds of roofless houses and a tangled maze of streets where one could easily get lost without a guide and have to sleep in some ghostly palace that had known no living tenant since that awful November of 18 centuries ago. We passed through the gate which faces the Mediterranean, called the Marine Gate, and by the rusty, broken image of Minerva still keeping tireless watch and ward over the possessions it was powerless to save, and went up a long street and stood in the broad court of the Forum of Justice. The floor was level and clean, and up and down either side was a noble colonnade of broken pillars, with their beautiful Ionic and Corinthian columns scattered about them. At the upper end were the vacant seats of the judges, and behind them we descended into a dungeon where the ashes and cinders had found 2 prisoners, chained on that memorable November night, and tortured them to death. How they must have tugged at the pitiless fetters as the fierce fires surged around them. Then we lounged through many and many a sumptuous private mansion, which we could not have entered without a formal invitation in incomprehensible Latin in the olden time when the owners lived there, and we probably wouldn't have got it. These people built their houses a good deal alike. The floors were laid in fanciful figures wrought in mosaics of many-colored marbles. At the threshold your eyes fall upon a Latin sentence of welcome, sometimes, or a picture of a dog, with the legend, "Beware of the dog," and sometimes a picture of a bear or a fawn, with no inscription at all. Then you enter a sort of vestibule, where they used to keep the hat rack, I suppose. Next, a room with a large marble basin in the midst, and the pipes of a fountain on either side are bedrooms. Beyond the fountain is a reception room, then a little garden, dining room, and so forth and so on. The floors were all mosaic. The walls were stuccoed or frescoed or ornamented with bas-reliefs, and here and there were statues, large and small, and little fish pools and cascades of sparkling water that ran from secret places in the colonnade of handsome pillars that surrounded the court and kept the flower beds fresh and the air cool. Those Pompeians were very luxurious in their tastes and habits, The most exquisite bronzes we have seen in Europe came from the exhumed cities of Herculaneum and Pompeii, and also the finest cameos and the most delicate engravings on precious stones. Their pictures, 18 or 19 centuries old, are often much more pleasing than the celebrated rubbish of the old masters of 3 centuries ago. They were well up in art, from the creation of these works of the first clear up to the 11th century. Art seems hardly to have existed at all. At least no remnants of it are left, and it was curious to see how far, in some things at any rate, these old-time pagans excelled the remote generations of masters that came after them. The pride of the world in sculptures seemed to be the Laocoon and the Dying Gladiator in Rome. They are as old as Pompeii, were dug from the earth like Pompeii, but their exact age or who made them can only be conjectured. But worn and cracked, without a history, and with the blemish and stains of numberless centuries upon them, they still mutely mock at all efforts to rival their perfections. It was a quaint and curious pastime, wandering through this old, silent city of the dead, lounging through utterly deserted streets where thousands and thousands of human beings once bought and sold and walked and rode, and made the place resound with the noise and confusion of traffic and pleasure. They were not lazy. They hurried in those days. We had evidence of that. There was a temple on one corner, and it was a shorter cut to go between the columns of that temple from one street on the other than to go around. And behold, that pathway had been worn deep into the heavy flagstone floor of the building by generations of time-saving feet. They would not go around when it was quicker to go through. We do that way in our cities. Everywhere you see things that make you wonder how old these old houses were before the night of destruction came. Things, too, which bring back those long dead inhabitants and place the living before your eyes. For instance, the steps, 2 feet thick, lava blocks that lead up out of the school, and the same kind of steps that lead up into the dress circle of the principal theater, are almost worn through. For ages the boys hurried out of that school, and for ages their parents hurried into that theater, and the nervous feet that have been dust and ashes for 18 centuries have left their record for us to read today. I imagined I could see crowds of gentlemen and ladies thronging into the theater, with tickets for secured seats in their hands, and on the wall I read the imaginary placard, in infamous grammar, "Positively no free list, except members of the press." Hanging about the doorway, I fancied, were slouchy Pompeian street boys, uttering slang and profanity, and keeping a wary eye out for checks. I entered the theater and sat down in one of the long rows of stone benches in the dress circle, and looked at the place for the orchestra and the ruined stage, and around at the wide sweep of empty boxes, and thought to myself, this house won't pay. I tried to imagine the music in full blast, the leader of the orchestra beating time, and the versatile so-and-so who had just returned from a most successful tour in the province to play his last and farewell engagement of positively 6 nights only in Pompeii, previous to his departure for Herculaneum, charging around the stage and piling the agony mountains high. But I could not do it with such a house as that. Those empty benches tied my fancy down to dull reality. I said, these people that ought to be here have been dead and still and moldering to dust for ages and ages, and will never care for the trifles and follies of life any more forever. Owing to circumstances, etc., etc., there will not be any performance tonight. Close down the curtain. Put out the lights. And so I turned away and went through shop after shop and store after store, far down the long street of the merchants, and called for the wares of Rome and the East. But the tradesmen were gone, the marts were silent, and nothing was left but the jars all set in cement of cinders and ashes. The wine and the oil that once had filled them were gone with their owners. In a bake shop was a mill for grinding the grain, and the furnaces for baking the bread, and they sat there. They say that here, in the same furnaces, the exhumers of Pompeii found nice, well-baked loaves, which the baker had not found time to remove for the ovens the last time he left his shop, because circumstances compelled him to leave in such a hurry. In one house, the only building in Pompeii which no woman is now allowed to enter, were the small rooms and short beds of solid masonry, just as they were in the old times, and on the walls were pictures which looked almost as fresh as if they were painted yesterday, but which no pen could have the hardihood to describe, and here and there were Latin descriptions, obscene scintillations of wit, scratched by hands that possibly were uplifted to heaven for succor in the midst of a driving storm of fire before the night was done. In one of the principal streets was a ponderous stone tank and a waterspout that supplied it, and where the tired, heated toilers from the Campagna used to rest their right hands when they bent over to put their lips to the spout, the thick stone was worn down to a broad groove an inch or two deep. Think of the countless thousands of hands that had pressed that spot in the ages that are gone, to so reduce a stone that is as hard as iron. They had a great public bulletin board on Pompeii, a place where announcements for gladiatorial combats, elections, and such things were posted, not on perishable paper, but carved in enduring stone. One lady, who I take it was rich and well brought up, advertised a dwelling or so to rent, with baths and all the modern improvements, and several hundred shops, stipulating that the dwellings should not be put to immoral purposes. You can find out who lived in many a house in Pompeii by the carved stone door plates affixed to them, and in the same way you can tell who they were that occupy the tombs. Everywhere around are things that reveal to you something of the customs and history of this forgotten people. But what would a volcano leave of an American city if it once rained its cinders on it? Hardly a sign or a symbol to tell its story. In one of these long Pompeian halls, the skeleton of a man was found, with 10 pieces of gold in one hand and a large key in the other. He had seized his money and started toward the door, but the fiery tempest caught him at the very threshold, and he sank down and died. One more minute of precious time would have saved him. I saw the skeletons of a man, a woman, and 2 young girls. The woman had her hands spread wide apart, as if in mortal terror, and I imagined I could still trace upon her shapeless face something of the expression of wild despair that distorted it when the heavens rained fire in these streets so many ages ago. The girls and the man lay with their faces upon their arms, as if they had tried to shield them from the enveloping cinders. In one apartment, 18 skeletons were found, all in sitting postures, and blackened places on the wall still mark their shapes and show their attitudes, like shadows. One of them, a woman, still wore upon her skeleton throat a necklace with her name graved upon it, Julie de Diomede. But perhaps the most poetical thing Pompeii has yielded to modern research was that grand figure of a Roman soldier, clad in complete armor, who, true to his duty, true to his proud name of a soldier of Rome, and full of the stern courage which had given to that name its glory, stood to his post by the city gate, erect and unflinching, till the hell that raged around him burned out the dauntless spirit it could not conquer. We never read of Pompeii, but we think of that soldier. We cannot write of Pompeii without the natural impulse to grant to him the mention he so well deserves. Let us remember that he was a soldier, not a policeman, and so praise him. Being a soldier, he stayed, because the warrior instinct forbade him to fly. Had he been a policeman, he would have stayed also, because he would have been asleep. There are not half a dozen flights of stairs in Pompeii, and no other evidences that the houses were more than 1 story high. The people did not live in the clouds, as do the Venetians, the Genoese, and the Neapolitans of today. We came out from under the solemn mysteries of this city of the venerable past, this city which perished, with all its old ways and its quaint old fashions about it, remote centuries ago, when the disciples were preaching a new religion, which is as old as the hills to us now, and went dreaming among the trees that grow over acres and acres of its still buried streets and squares, till a shrill whistle and the cry of "All aboard! Last train for Naples!" woke me up and reminded me that I belonged in the 19th century, and was not a dusty mummy, caked with ashes and cinders, 1800 years old. The transition was startling. The idea of a railroad train actually running to old dead Pompeii and whistling irreverently and calling for passengers in the most bustling and businesslike way was as strange a thing as one could imagine, and as unpoetical and disagreeable as it was strange. Compare the cheerful life in the sunshine of this day with the horrors the younger Pliny saw. The 9th of November, A.D. 79, when he was so bravely striving to remove his mother out of reach of harm, while she begged him, with all a mother's unselfishness, to leave her to perish and save himself. By this time the murky darkness had so increased that one might have believed himself abroad in a black and moonless night, or in a chamber where all the lights had been extinguished. On every hand was heard the complaints of women, the wailing of children, and the cries of men. One called his father, another his son, and another his wife, and only by their voices could they know each other. Many, in their despair, begged that death would come and end their distress. Some implored the gods to succor them, and some believed that this night was the last, the eternal night which should engulf the universe. Even so it seemed to me, and I consoled myself for the coming death with the reflection, "Behold, the world is passing away." After browsing among the stately ruins of Rome, the Baiae of Pompeii, and after glancing down the long marble ranks of battered and nameless imperial heads that stretch down the corridors of the Vatican, one thing strikes me with a force it never had before: the unsubstantial, unlasting character of fame. Men lived long lives in the olden time, and struggled feverishly through them, toiling like slaves in oratory and generalship or in literature, and then laid them down and died, happy in the possession of an enduring history and a deathless name. Well, 20 little centuries flutter away, and what is left of these things? A crazy inscription on a block of stone, which snuffy antiquaries bother over and tangle up and make nothing out of but a bare name, which they spell wrong. No history, no tradition, no poetry, nothing that can give it even a passing interest. What may be left of General Grant's great name 40 centuries hence? This in the encyclopedia for A.D. 5868, possibly. Uriah S. or Z. Grant, popular poet of ancient times in the Aztec provinces of the United States of British America. Some authors say flourished about A.D. 742, but learned Ahu Fufu states that he was a contemporary of Shakespeare, the English poet, and flourished about A.D. 1328, some 3 centuries after the Trojan War instead of before it. He wrote, "Rock me to sleep, mother." These thoughts sadden me. I will to bed. Chapter 32. Home again. For the first time in many weeks, the ship's entire family met and shook hands on the quarterdeck. They had gathered from many points of the compass and from many lands, but not one was missing. There was no tale of sickness or death among the flock to dampen the pleasure of the reunion. Once more there was a full audience on deck to listen to the sailors' chorus as they got the anchor up, and to wave an adieu to the land as we sped away from Naples. The seats were full at dinner again. The domino parties were complete, and the life and bustle on the upper deck in the fine moonlight at night was like old times that had been gone weeks only, but yet they were weeks so crowded with incident, adventure, and excitement that they seemed almost like years. There was no lack of cheerfulness on board the Quaker City. For once, her title was a misnomer. At 7 in the evening, with the western horizon all golden from the sunken sun and specked with distant ships, the full moon sailing high overhead, the dark blue of the sea underfoot, and a strange sort of twilight affected by all these different lights and colors around us and about us, we sighted superb Stromboli. With what majesty the monarch held his lonely state above the level sea. Distance clothed him in a purple gloom, and added a veil of shimmering mist that so softened his rugged features that we seemed to see him through a web of silver gauze. His torch was out, his fires were smoldering. A tall column of smoke that rose up and lost itself in the growing moonlight was all the sign he gave that he was a living autocrat of the sea, and not the specter of a dead one. At 2 in the morning, we swept through the Straits of Messina, and so bright was the moonlight that Italy on the one hand and Sicily on the other seemed almost as distinctly visible as though we looked at them from the middle of a street we were traversing. The city of Messina, milk-white and starred and spangled all over with gaslights, was a fairy spectacle. A great party of us were on deck smoking and making a noise and waiting to see famous Scylla and Charybdis, and presently the oracle stepped out with his eternal spyglass and squared himself on the deck like another Colossus of Rhodes. It was a surprise to see him abroad at such an hour. Nobody supposed he cared anything about an old fable like that of Scylla and Charybdis. One of the boys said, "Hello, Doctor. What are you doing up here at this time of night? What do you want to see this place for?" "What do I want to see this place for, young man? Little do you know me, or you wouldn't ask such a question. I wish to see all the places that's mentioned in the Bible." "Stuff. This place isn't mentioned in the Bible." "It ain't mentioned in the Bible. This place ain't. Well, now, what is this place, since you know so much about it?" "Why, it's Scylla and Charybdis." "Scylla and Confound it, I thought that was Sodom and Gomorrah." And he closed up his glass and went below. The above is the ship story. Its plausibility is marred a little by the fact that the oracle was not a biblical student and did not spend much of his time instructing himself about scriptural localities. They say the oracle complains in this hot weather lately that the only beverage in the ship that is passable is the butter. He did not mean butter, of course, but inasmuch as that article remains in a melted state, now since we are out of ice, it is fair to give him the credit of getting one long word in the right place, anyhow, for once in his life. He said in Rome that the Pope was a noble-looking old man, but he never did think much of his Iliad. We spent one pleasant day skirting along the Isles of Greece. They are very mountainous. Their prevailing tints are gray and brown, approaching to red. Little white villages surrounded by trees nestle in the valleys or roost upon the lofty perpendicular sea walls. We had one fine sunset, a rich carmine flush that suffused the western sky and cast a ruddy glow far over the sea. Fine sunsets seem to be rare in this part of the world, or at least striking ones. They are soft, sensuous, lovely. They are exquisite, refined, effeminate, but we have seen no sunsets here yet like the gorgeous conflagrations that flame in the track of the sinking sun in our high northern latitudes. But what were sunsets to us, with the wild excitement upon us of approaching the most renowned of cities? What cared we for outward visions when Agamemnon, Achilles and 1,000 other heroes of the great past were marching in ghostly procession through our fancies. What were sunsets to us, who were about to live and breathe and walk in actual Athens, yea, and go far down into the dead centuries and bid in person for the slaves, Diogenes and Plato, in the public marketplace, or gossip with the neighbors about the siege of Troy or the splendid deeds of Marathon? We scorned to consider sunsets. We arrived and entered the ancient harbor of Piraeus at last. We dropped anchor within half a mile of the village. Away off, across the undulating plain of Attica, could be seen a little square-topped hill with a something on it, which our glasses soon discovered to be the ruined edifices of the citadel of the Athenians, and most prominent among them loomed the venerable Parthenon, so exquisitely clear and pure in this wonderful atmosphere that every column of the noble structure was discernible through the telescope, and even the smaller ruins about it assumed some semblance of shape. This at a distance of 5 or 6 miles. In the valley near the Acropolis, the square-topped hill before spoken of, Athens itself could be vaguely made out with an ordinary lorgnette. Everybody was anxious to get ashore and visit these classic localities as quickly as possible. No land we had yet seen had aroused such universal interest among the passengers. But bad news came. The commandant of the Piraeus came in his boat and said we must either part or else get outside the harbor and remain imprisoned in our ship under rigid quarantine for 11 days. So we took up the anchor and moved outside to lie a dozen hours or so, taking in supplies, and then sail for Constantinople. It was the bitterest disappointment we had yet experienced, to lie a whole day in sight of the Acropolis, and yet be obliged to go away without visiting Athens. Disappointment was hardly a strong enough word to describe the circumstances. All hands were on deck all the afternoon, with books and maps and glasses, trying to determine which narrow, rocky ridge was the Areopagus, which sloping hill the Pnyx, which elevation the Museum Hill, and so on. And we got things confused. Discussion became heated, and party spirit ran high. Church members were gazing with emotion upon a hill which they said was the one St. Paul preached from, and another faction claimed that that hill was Hymettus, and another that it was Pentelicon. After all the trouble, we could be certain of only one thing. The square-topped hill was the Acropolis, and the grand ruin that crowned it was the Parthenon, whose pictures we knew in infancy in the school books. We inquired of everybody who came near the ship, whether there were guards in the Piraeus, whether they were strict, what the chances were of capture should any of us slip ashore, and in any case any of us made the venture and were caught, what would be probably done to us. The answers were discouraging. There was a strong guard or police force. The Piraeus was a small town, and any stranger seen in it would surely attract attention. Capture would be certain. The commandant said the punishment would be heavy. When asked how heavy, he said it would be very severe. That was all we could get out of him. At 11 o'clock at night, when most of the ship's company were abed, 4 of us stole softly ashore in a small boat, a clouded moon favoring the enterprise, and started 2 and 2 and far apart over a low hill, intending to go clear around the Piraeus out of the range of its police. Picking our way so stealthily over that rocky, nettle-grown eminence made me feel a good deal as if I were on my way somewhere to steal something. My immediate comrade and I talked in an undertone about quarantine laws and their penalties, but we found nothing cheering in the subject. I was posted. Only a few days before, I was talking with our captain, and he mentioned the case of a man who swam ashore from a quarantine ship somewhere and got imprisoned 6 months for it. And when he was in Genoa a few years ago, a captain of a quarantine ship went in his boat to a departing ship which was already outside of the harbor, and put a letter on board to be taken to his family, and the authorities imprisoned him 3 months for it, and then conducted him and his ship fairly to sea, and warned him never to show himself in that port again while he lived. This kind of conversation did no good, further than to give a sort of dismal interest to our quarantine breaking expedition, and so we dropped it. We made the entire circuit of the town without seeing anybody but one man, who stared at us curiously but said nothing, and a dozen persons asleep on the ground before their doors, whom we walked among and never woke, but we woke up dogs enough, in all conscience. We always had one or two barking at our heels, and several times we had as many as 10 and 12 at once. They made such a preposterous din that persons aboard our ship said they could tell how we were progressing for a long time, and where we were, by the barking of the dogs. The clouded moon still favored us. When we had made the whole circuit, and were passing among the houses on the furthest side of town, the moon came out splendidly, but we no longer feared the light. As we approached a well near a house to get a drink, the owner merely glanced at us and went within. He left the quiet, slumbering town at our mercy. I record it here proudly that we didn't do anything to it. Seeing no road, we took a tall hill to the left of the distant Acropolis for a mark, and steered straight for it over all obstructions, and over a little rougher piece of country than exists anywhere else outside of the state of Nevada, perhaps. Part of the way it was covered with small, loose stones. We trod on 6 at a time, and they all rolled. Another part of it was dry, loose, newly plowed ground. Still another part of it was a long stretch of low grapevines, which were tanglesome and troublesome, and which we took to be brambles. The Attic plain, barring the grapevines, was a barren, desolate, unpoetical waste. I wonder what it was in Greece's age of glory, 500 years before Christ. In the neighborhood of 1 o'clock in the morning, when we were heated with fast walking and parched with thirst, Danny exclaimed, "Why, these weeds are grapevines!" And in 5 minutes we had a score of bunches of large, white, delicious grapes, and were reaching down for more when a dark shape rose mysteriously up out of the shadows beside us and said, "Ho!" And so we left. In 10 minutes more we struck into a beautiful road, and unlike some others we had stumbled upon at intervals, it led in the right direction. We followed it. It was broad and smooth and white, handsome and in perfect repair, and shaded on both sides for a mile or so with single ranks of trees, and also with luxuriant vineyards. Twice we entered and stole grapes, and the second time somebody shouted at us from some invisible place, whereupon we left again. We speculated in grapes no more on that side of Athens. Shortly we came upon an ancient stone aqueduct, built upon arches, and from that time forth we had ruins all about us. We were approaching our journey's end. We could not see the Acropolis now, or the high hill either, and I wanted to follow the road till we were abreast of them, but the others overruled me, and we toiled laboriously up the stony hill immediately in our front, and from its summit saw another, climbed it, and saw another. It was an hour of exhausting work. Soon we came upon a row of open graves, cut in the solid rock. For a while, one of them served Socrates for a prison. We passed around the shoulder of the hill, and the citadel in all its ruined magnificence burst upon us. We hurried across the ravine and up a winding road, and stood on the old Acropolis, with the prodigious walls of the citadel towering above our heads. We did not stop to inspect their massive blocks of marble, or measure their height, or guess at their extraordinary thickness, but passed at once through a great arched passage like a railway tunnel, and went straight to the gate that leads to the ancient temples. It was locked. After all, it seemed that we were not to see the great Parthenon face to face. We sat down and held a council of war. Result: the gate was only a flimsy structure of wood. We would break it down. It seemed like desecration, but then we had traveled far, and our necessities were urgent. We could not hunt up guides and keepers. We must be on the ship before daylight, so we argued. This was all very fine, but when we came to break the gate, we could not do it. We moved around an angle of the wall and found a low bastion, 8 feet high without, 10 or 12 feet within. Denny prepared to scale it, and we got ready to follow. By dint of hard scrambling, we finally straddled the top, but some loose stones crumbled away and fell with a crash into the court within. There was instantly a banging of doors and a shout. Denny dropped from the wall in a twinkling, and we retreated in disorder to the gate. Xerxes took that mighty citadel 480 years before Christ, when his 5 millions of soldiers and camp followers followed him to Greece. And if we 4 Americans could have remained unmolested 5 minutes longer, we would have taken it too. The garrison had turned out 4 Greeks. We clamored at the gate, and they admitted us. Bribery and corruption. We crossed a large court, entered a great door, and stood upon a pavement of purest white marble, deeply worn by footprints. Before us, in the flooding moonlight, rose the noblest ruins we had ever looked upon. The Propylae, a small temple of Minerva, the temple of Hercules, and the grand Parthenon. We got these names from the Greek guide, who didn't seem to know more than 7 men ought to know. These edifices were all built of the whitest Pentelic marble, but have a pinkish stain upon them now. Where any part is broken, however, the fracture looks like a fine loaf of sugar. 6 caryatides, or marble women, clad in flowing robes, support the portico of the Temple of Hercules, but the porticos and colonnades of the other structures are formed of massive Doric and Ionic pillars, whose flutings and capitals are still measurably perfect, notwithstanding the centuries that have gone over them and the sieges that they suffered. The Parthenon originally was 226 feet long, 100 wide, and 70 high, and had 2 rows of great columns, 8 in each, at either end, and single rows of 17 down each side, and was one of the most graceful and beautiful edifices ever erected. Most of the Parthenon's imposing columns are still standing, but the roof is gone. It is a perfect building 250 years ago, when a shell dropped into the Venetian magazine stored here, and the explosion which followed wrecked and unroofed it. I remember but little about the Parthenon, and I have put in 1 or 2 facts and figures for the use of other people with short memories. Got them from the guidebook. As we wandered thoughtfully down the marble-paved length of the stately temple, the scene about us was strangely impressive. Here and there, in lavish profusion, were gleaming white statues of men and women, propped against blocks of marble, some of them armless, some without legs, others headless, but all looking mournful in the moonlight and startlingly human. They rose up and confronted the midnight intruder on every side. They stared at him with stony eyes. From unlooked-for nooks and recesses, they peered at him over fragmentary heaps far down the desolate corridors. They barred his way in the midst of the broad forum, and solemnly pointed with handless arms the way from the sacred fane, and through the roofless temple the moon looked down and banded the floor and darkened the scattered fragments and broken statues with the slanting shadows of the columns. What a world of ruined sculpture was about us, set up in rows, stacked up in piles, Scattered broadcast over the wide area of the Acropolis were hundreds of crippled statues of all sizes and of the most exquisite workmanship, and vast fragments of marble that once belonged to the entablatures, covered with bas reliefs representing battles and sieges, ships of war with 3 and 4 tiers of oars, pageants and processions, everything one could think of. History says that the temples of the Acropolis were filled with the noblest works of Praxiteles and Phidias, and of many a great master in sculptures besides, and surely these elegant fragments attest it. We walked out into the grass-grown, fragment-strewn court beyond the Parthenon. It startled us every now and then to see a stony white face stare suddenly up at us out of the grass with its dead eyes. The place seemed alive with ghosts. I half expected to see the Athenian heroes of 20 centuries ago slide out of the shadows and steal into the old temple they knew so well and regarded with such boundless pride. The full moon was riding high in the cloudless heavens. Now, we sauntered carelessly and unthinkingly to the edge of the lofty battlements of the citadel and looked down. A vision, and such a vision, Athens by moonlight. The prophet that thought the splendors of the New Jerusalem were revealed to him surely saw this instead. It lay in the level plain right under our feet, all spread abroad like a picture, and we looked down upon it as we might have looked from a balloon. We saw no semblance of a street, but every house, every window, every clinging vine, every projection was as distinct and sharply marked as if the time were noonday, and yet there was no glare, no glitter, nothing harsh or repulsive. The noiseless city was flooded with the mellowest light that ever streamed from the moon, and seemed like some living creature wrapped in peaceful slumber. On its further side was a little temple, whose delicate pillars and ornate front glowed with a rich luster that chained the eye like a spell. And nearer by, the palace of the king reared its creamy walls out of the midst of a great garden of shrubbery that was flecked all over with a random shower of amber lights, a spray of golden sparks that lost their brightness in the glory of the moon and glinted softly upon the sea of dark foliage like the pallid stars of the Milky Way. Overhead, the stately columns, majestic still in their ruin, underfoot the dreaming city, in the distance the silver sea. Not on the broad earth is there another picture half so beautiful. As we turned and moved again through the temple, I wished that the illustrious men who had sat in it in the remote ages could visit it again and reveal themselves to our curious eyes. Plato, Aristotle, Demosthenes, Socrates, Phocion, Pythagoras, Euclid, Pindar, Xenophon, Herodotus, Praxiteles, and Phidias. Zeuxis the painter, what a constellation of celebrated names. But more than all, I wished that old Diogenes, groping so patiently with his lantern, searching so zealously for one solitary, honest man in all the world, might meander along and stumble on our party. I ought not to say it, maybe, but I still suppose he would have put out his light. We left the Parthenon to keep its watch over old Athens, as it had kept for 2,300 years, and went and stood outside the walls of the citadel. In the distance was the ancient, but still almost perfect, temple of Theseus, and close by, looking to the west, was the Bema, from whence Demosthenes thundered his Philippics and fired the wavering patriotism of his countrymen. To the right was Mars Hill, where the Areopagus sat in ancient times, and where St. Paul defined his position, and below was the marketplace where he disputed daily with the gossip-loving Athenians. We climbed the stone steps St. Paul ascended, and stood in the square-cut place he stood in, and tried to recollect the Bible account of the matter, but for certain reasons I could not recall the words. I have found them since. Now, while Paul waited for them at Athens, his spirit was stirred in him, when he saw the city wholly given up to idolatry. Therefore disputed he in the synagogue with the Jews, and with the devout persons, and in the market daily with them that met with him. And they took him and brought him unto Areopagus, saying, May we know what this new doctrine whereof thou speakest is? Then Paul stood in the midst of Mars Hill, and said, Ye men of Athens, I perceive that in all things ye are too superstitious. For as I passed by and beheld your devotions, I found an altar with this inscription, To the unknown God, whom therefore ye ignorantly worship, him declare I unto you. Acts chapter 17. It occurred to us after a while that if we wanted to get home before daylight betrayed us, we had better be moving. So we hurried away. When far on our road, we had a parting view of the Parthenon with the moonlight streaming through its open colonnades and touching its capitals with silver. As it looked then, solemn, grand, and beautiful, it will always remain in our memories. As we marched along, we began to get over our fears, and ceased to care much about quarantine scouts or anybody else. We grew bold and reckless, and once, in a sudden burst of courage, I even threw a stone at a dog. It was a pleasant reflection, though, that I did not hit him, because his master might just possibly have been a policeman. Inspired by this happy failure, my valor became utterly uncontrollable, and at intervals I absolutely whistled, though on a moderate key. But boldness breeds boldness, and shortly I plunged into a vineyard in the full light of the moon, and captured a gallon of superb grapes, not even mine, in the presence of a peasant who rode by on a mule. Denny and Birch followed by example. Now I had grapes enough for a dozen, but then Jackson was all swollen up with courage too, and he was obliged to enter a vineyard presently. The first bunch he seized brought trouble. A frowsy, bearded brigand. Advancing with celerity, the brigand shouted again, but still we advanced. It was getting late, and we had no time to fool away on every ass that wanted to drivel Greek platitudes to us. We would just as soon have talked with him as not if we had not been in a hurry. Presently, Denny said, "Those fellows are following us." We turned, and sure enough, there they were, 3 fantastic pirates armed with guns. We slackened our pace to let them come up, and in the meantime I got out my cargo of grapes and dropped them firmly but reluctantly into the shadows by the wayside. But I was not afraid. I only felt that it was not right to steal grapes, and all the more so when the owner was around, and not only around, but with his friends also. The villains came up and searched a bundle Dr. Birch had in his hand, and scowled upon him when they found it had nothing in it but some holy rocks from Mars Hill, and these were not contraband. They evidently suspected him of playing some wretched fraud upon them, and seemed half inclined to scalp the party, but finally they dismissed us with a warning, couched in excellent Greek, I suppose, and dropped tranquility in our wake. When they had gone 300 yards, they stopped, and we went on, rejoiced. But behold, another armed rascal came out of the shadows and took their place, and followed us 200 yards. Then he delivered us over to another miscreant, who emerged from some mysterious place, and he in turn to another. For a mile and a half our rear was guarded by all the while by armed men. I never traveled so much in state before in all my life. It was a good while after that before we ventured to steal any more grapes, and when we did, we stirred up another troublesome brigand, and then we ceased all further speculation in that line. I suppose that fellow that rode by on the mule posted all the sentinels from Athens to the Piraeus about us. Every field on that long route was watched by an armed sentinel, some of whom had fallen asleep, no doubt, but were on hand nevertheless. This shows what sort of country a modern Attica is, a community of questionable characters. These men were not there to guard their possessions against strangers, but against each other, for strangers seldom visit Athens and the Piraeus, and when they do, they go in daylight and can buy all the grapes they want for a trifle. The modern inhabitants are confiscators and falsifiers of high repute, if gossip speaks truly concerning them, and I believe it does. Just as the earliest tinges of the dawn flushed the eastern sky and turned the pillared Parthenon to a broken harp hung in the pearly horizon, we closed our 13th mile of weary, roundabout marching and emerged upon the seashore abreast the ships with our usual escort of 1,500 Parian dogs howling at our heels. We hailed a boat that was 200 or 300 yards from shore and discovered in a moment that it was a police boat on the lookout for any quarantine breakers that might chance to be aboard. So we dodged. We were used to that by this time, and when the scouts reached the spot we had so lately occupied, we were absent. They cruised along the shore, but in the wrong direction, and shortly our own boat issued from the gloom and took us aboard. They had heard our signal on the ship. We rowed noiselessly away, and before the police boat came in sight again, we were safely at home once more. 4 more of our passengers were anxious to visit Athens and started half an hour after we returned, but they had not been ashore 5 minutes till the police discovered and chased them so hotly that they barely escaped to their boat again, and that was all. They pursued the enterprise no further. We set sail for Constantinople today, but some of us little care for that. We have seen all there was to see in the old city that had birthed its 1,600 years before Christ was born, and was an old town before the foundations of Troy were laid, and saw it in its most attractive aspect. Wherefore, why should we worry? 2 other passengers ran the blockade successfully last night, so we learned this morning. They slipped away so quietly that they were not missed from the ship for several hours. They had the hardihood to march into the Piraeus in the early dusk and hire a carriage. They ran some danger of adding 2 or 3 months' imprisonment to the other novelties of their Holy Land pleasure excursion. I admire cheek, quotation from the Pilgrims, but they went and came safely, and never walked a step,